Malik Johnson had never been the kind of man who thought much about himself. Most of his energy went into raising his little girl and making sure she never felt the weight of what they didn't have. Still, on this chilly Boston evening, he found himself smoothing the sleeves of an old shirt, the fabric softened by years of wear. The collar pressed as neatly as he could manage. It wasn't new. It wasn't stylish, but it was clean, and for him, that was enough. Tonight was different. Tonight, he had taken $50 from the envelope he usually kept hidden in the back of a drawer, money set aside for emergencies, and told himself it was worth the risk. The restaurant wasn't 5-star. It wasn't the kind of place that made magazine covers, but with its polished wooden booths, its navy linens, and the quiet hum of weekday conversation, it felt like a world away from his cramped apartment. The glow from the candles on each table cast shadows that seemed softer, kinder, almost like the room itself wanted people to believe in new beginnings. Malik paused at the door, took a breath, and stepped inside, his heart thudding with the kind of nervous hope he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't used to thinking of himself as a man on a date. He was a father first, a worker second, and somewhere far down the line, just Malik. Yet, as he followed the hostess through the room, he let himself imagine what it might be like to share his life again, not just with his daughter, but with someone who might see him as more than a man carrying responsibilities. When he sat down at the small table by the window, he set his wallet carefully in his pocket, rehearsing silently how he would pace himself if the menu prices climbed too high. He could stretch $50. He always had. But he didn't want to look like he was stretching. Not tonight. Malik checked his watch once, then again, the minute hand seeming to drag as if it too were caught in the weight of waiting. 6:45 had slipped into 7. 7 became 7:15. Each time the door opened, his head lifted with a small rush of hope, only for it to fall again as couples wandered in together, laughing, brushing snowflakes from their coats. He told himself to be patient. Maybe she was caught in traffic. Maybe she had stopped to fix her hair. Maybe, just maybe, she would still walk through the door. By 7:30, the excuses had worn thin. Malik scrolled through his phone, reading the last line she had sent that afternoon. "Can't wait to see you tonight." The words were there, glowing on the screen, so familiar it hurt. He tapped out a quick message. "I'm here, just checking in." He watched the screen, waiting for the little dots that never came. When the buzz finally came, his body jolted as though pulled toward hope again. But the words that appeared froze him in place. "Wow, you actually went. I was just messing with you. Sorry, but you're not really my type. Not worth the Uber." A second message followed almost immediately. "You seem nice, but seriously, you thought I was actually coming?" Malik stared, the letters blurring for a moment, as if the phone itself had betrayed him. He pressed his lips together hard, willing back the sting that threatened to rise in his eyes. Around him, the restaurant carried on as if nothing had happened. Forks scraping plates, soft music spilling from hidden speakers, the low hum of conversations that belonged to people who were wanted, people who belonged. He sat still, holding his phone in his hand as though releasing it would mean accepting it was real. Heat crept up his neck, the kind of heat that comes not from anger, but from humiliation. His fingers tightened around the phone, knuckles straining against skin that had seen too much sun and hard work. The server passed by, offering a polite smile. "Would you like to order something, sir?" Malik shook his head quickly, his voice catching in his throat. "No, thank you. I'm still waiting." But he wasn't. He knew it. He shifted in his seat, opening his worn wallet under the table. Inside was a single folded bill, a 5 he had promised himself he wouldn't touch unless he absolutely had to. $50 had already felt like too much. But at least he had carried the quiet hope of sharing a meal, of not eating alone. Now even that was gone. He placed the wallet back in his pocket, fingers trembling as he pulled the napkin tighter across his lap, trying to mask the hollow ache in his stomach. He told himself not to cry. Men didn't cry in public, not men with children to raise and pride to protect. But there was no denying the weight pressing on his chest, the familiar whisper that maybe he wasn't enough, never enough to be worth showing up for. The minutes trickled by. Couples leaned across tables, hands brushing, eyes sparkling in the candlelight. Malik sat alone, his glass nearly empty, the water doing little to calm the hunger that clawed at him. His jaw tightened, his gaze fixed once more on the door, as if willpower alone might conjure the figure who would never appear. Naomi Caldwell had come to the restaurant that evening out of habit more than need. After a long day of meetings and presentations at Caldwell Organics, she often chose this quiet corner table to unwind. The polished wood, the low candlelight, the steady rhythm of silverware and soft music, it gave her space to think, to exhale. Her natural hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, her deep brown skin glowing in the warm light. She wore a tailored blazer that spoke of success without screaming it, paired with simple gold earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. Her phone buzzed with unread emails, but she had set it face down beside her glass of wine. For once, she wanted to be present in a room instead of buried in numbers and projections. It was then that she noticed him. A black man sitting by the window, his shirt simple, pressed with the kind of care that speaks louder than any designer label. His posture was straight, almost too straight, as though he carried the weight of holding himself together. Every few minutes his eyes flicked toward the entrance with a hope so raw it made her pause. She had seen confidence in boardrooms, ambition in negotiations, arrogance at networking events. But hope, that fragile, trembling thing, was rare. At first, Naomi told herself not to stare. People came and went, lives crossed in silence all the time. Yet something about the way he clutched his phone, how his thumb hovered over the screen as if willing it to light up, tugged at her attention. She saw the faint tightening of his jaw when it finally did, the flicker of relief that flashed across his face, only to be crushed an instant later. He read the message again, and though she couldn't see the words, she knew the language. Disappointment had a way of etching itself into posture, into the slope of a shoulder, into the dimming of a gaze. Naomi leaned back slightly, letting her wine rest on the table. She was no stranger to rejection, though hers had often come dressed in boardroom suits and carefully worded letters. Still, she recognized that expression, the stubborn straightening of the spine, the desperate attempt to look unaffected while the heart cracked quietly underneath. Her eyes softened as she continued to observe him. The glass of water on his table was nearly empty, and still no plate had been set down. She noticed how his fingers tapped gently against the rim, not impatiently but nervously, like a man debating whether to leave or to hold out just a little longer. He wasn't just waiting for dinner, he was waiting to be chosen, to matter, to be worth the effort of someone walking through the door. And when that someone never arrived, she saw the loneliness spread across his face like a shadow. Naomi felt an unexpected ache in her chest. She had built her life on control, on being the one who decided outcomes. But here she was, watching a stranger being quietly broken by a cruel trick, and she could not shake the thought that kindness, simple and uncalculated, might mean more in this moment than any deal she had ever closed. She raised her hand and caught the eye of a passing server, leaning in just enough so their quiet exchange wouldn't draw attention. "A plate of your pasta, the house favorite," she murmured, sliding her card across the tray before he could even nod. "And a glass of sparkling lemonade. Charge it now. Deliver it to the man by the window." The server hesitated only a moment, then nodded, recognizing the weight in her tone. Malik didn't notice her at first when the steaming plate was set down in front of him. He blinked, confused, shaking his head slightly. "I didn't order this," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. The server smiled kindly, repeating the line Naomi had asked him to give. "It's been taken care of, sir. Someone requested it for you, and the bill is already settled." Malik froze, the napkin slipping from his lap to the floor. His first instinct wasn't gratitude, but suspicion. Was this another joke? Another cruel reminder that the world could be merciless? He looked around, searching the faces at nearby tables for smirks, for laughter waiting to explode at his expense. That was when her voice reached him, low, even, steady. "It's not charity," Naomi said from just behind him, her words threading gently through the air. "It's a reminder. You deserve to eat, even if the world tries to tell you otherwise." Malik turned, startled, and his eyes landed on her. A woman with rich, dark skin that seemed to glow in the candlelight, her hair in an elegant style that framed high cheekbones and eyes that held both strength and kindness. She wasn't smiling to dazzle him. She wasn't pitying him. She was simply present. And in that presence, there was a kind of honesty he hadn't known how much he needed. "I don't," he began, but the words caught. No one had ever said something like that to him. He had been told to toughen up, to make do, to push through, never that he deserved something as simple, as human, as a warm meal. Naomi stepped forward, resting a hand lightly on the back of the chair across from his. "May I?" she asked, though her tone suggested she would sit regardless of his answer. Malik nodded numbly, still reeling. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound between them was the faint fizz of the lemonade glass and the hum of the restaurant around them. Malik's hand hovered above the fork, uncertain, as though accepting the food meant accepting a kindness he wasn't sure how to hold. "You didn't have to do this," he said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. "I know," Naomi replied, her eyes steady on his. "That's why it matters." The words settled between them like a stone in a still pond, rippling outward. Malik looked down at the pasta, the steam curling upward, warm and real. His stomach twisted with hunger, but it was his chest that ached the most. Because in that single moment, he realized someone had seen him, not as a man left behind, not as a father barely scraping by, but as a person worthy of notice. He lifted the fork at last, his movements tentative, as though testing the truth of her gesture. The first bite broke something open inside him. It wasn't just food. It was dignity served on a plate, a reminder that he hadn't been entirely invisible. "No one's ever said that to me before," Malik said, setting the fork down, his voice unsteady but sincere. Naomi leaned back slightly, her own glass of wine untouched, her lips curving in the faintest shadow of a smile. Then it was long overdue. They talked quietly as he ate, not about anything heavy, just simple things. The restaurant's music, the strange Boston weather, how the pasta recipe had apparently been passed down from the owner's grandmother. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't an interrogation. It was simply two people sharing space at the same table. When the plate was finally empty, Malik set down his fork slowly, as if afraid the spell might break with the last bite. Naomi reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out a small white card, and slid it across the table. "I come here often," she said, her tone still gentle, without pressure. "Sometimes for the coffee, never for the company. But if you ever feel like being seen again, you know where to find me." Malik stared at the card resting against the candlelight, her name printed in bold letters, the title beneath it heavier than anything he could have imagined. CEO, Caldwell Organics. He looked up, but she was already rising, her glass of wine barely touched. She gave him a small nod, not a goodbye, not a promise, but something in between, and walked toward the door. For a long moment, Malik stayed seated, the card still warm from her hand lying against his palm. The room buzzed on around him, but all he could hear was the echo of her words. "You showed up. You believed." A week later, Malik pushed open the door of a small cafe tucked between the public library and a row of old brick buildings. It was the kind of place he stopped at only when his budget allowed, usually for a plain coffee and a few quiet minutes while Ava colored at the library across the street. Before he could order, a familiar voice drifted from behind him. "Make it 2, and add oat milk to his." Malik turned, startled, and there she was. Naomi sitting in the corner near the window, a laptop open in front of her, sleeves of her blazer rolled up just enough to make her look less like a CEO and more like someone simply passing the morning. "You remembered my coffee?" he said quietly as he approached. "I remembered your courage," Naomi replied, her eyes meeting his with the same calm honesty he had seen that night. The coffee was the easy part. They sat together, sipping their drinks, letting the soft hum of conversation and the golden morning light fill the space between them. The conversation flowed easily. She told him about a disastrous product launch where their toddler snack line slogan had gone viral for all the wrong reasons. He laughed, genuine and unforced, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't performing or apologizing. He was simply present. A week after their coffee, an unexpected message lit up Malik's phone. "Thought this might align with your world. No pressure. Naomi, quote. Attached was a digital pass to a workshop on early childhood nutrition hosted by Caldwell Organics. Malik hesitated at first. He wasn't a doctor or researcher. He was just a father who had learned through trial and error how to stretch $1 into a meal. But something in her wording, no pressure, pushed him to show up. The conference room was filled with pediatricians, young mothers, and students scribbling notes. Malik sat near the back, but when the speaker asked if anyone had questions, his hand went up before he realized it. "What about single parents who don't have time to cook everything fresh?" Malik asked, his voice steady, but carrying the honesty of lived experience. "Sometimes you're choosing between frozen dinners or nothing. What should we be looking for on the labels when time and money are both against you?" The room grew still, eyes turning his way. The speaker paused, then smiled. "That's a very good question." From the back, Naomi watched quietly. She had seen ambitious interns ask clever questions, but this was different. Malik wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was a father speaking because it mattered to his child. After the session ended, Malik slipped out quickly, heading toward the library where Ava often waited for him after school. In the children's corner, Ava sat cross-legged on the rug, her hair in neat braids with colorful beads that clicked softly when she moved, her tiny hands flipping through a picture book. When she looked up and saw her father, she ran straight into his arms. Malik lifted her easily, pressing a kiss to her forehead, his face softening in a way Naomi had never seen before. Ava noticed Naomi first. The little girl peeked shyly from behind her father's shoulder, studying the elegant woman who stood a few steps away. Slowly, she slid down from Malik's arms, tugging at his sleeve before stepping closer to Naomi. Her tiny fingers reached for the hem of Naomi's coat, and she whispered with innocent certainty, "She smells like Mommy's perfume." The air seemed to still. Malik froze, his breath caught sharp in his chest. His eyes darted to Naomi, then back to his daughter, as if unsure how to shield them both from the weight of those words. Naomi's composure faltered. Her throat tightened as the child's whisper sank deep. She crouched slowly, meeting Ava's gaze with a softness she hadn't allowed herself in years. "That's a big compliment," she said gently, her voice tender. "Your mommy must have had excellent taste." Ava nodded solemnly, satisfied, before skipping back toward the shelves. Malik stood rooted in place, his eyes glassy, though he refused to let the tears fall. "She doesn't usually say things like that," he managed quietly. Naomi looked at him, really looked, and saw not just a man abandoned at a dinner table, but a father holding on for his little girl. And in that fragile moment, something shifted between them. It began quietly, almost without either of them noticing. After that day in the library, Naomi found herself reaching out more often, not for meetings or contracts, but for something simpler. She would send Malik a draft of a product label and ask, "Would a parent like you actually trust this?" His answers were never polished, but they carried the weight of honesty. Malik, in turn, found himself leaning on her in ways he hadn't expected. On evenings when his shifts ran late or when Ava's daycare closed early, Naomi would stop by without hesitation. She never arrived empty-handed. Sometimes it was a stack of coloring books, sometimes just her calm presence, but always, Ava lit up the moment she walked in. One night, Ava had come down with a fever. Her small body curled under a blanket on the couch. Malik hovered anxiously, torn between the soup simmering on the stove and the worry knotting in his chest. When Naomi knocked softly and stepped inside, she didn't ask permission. She simply knelt beside the little girl, pressing a cool hand to her forehead. From her bag, she pulled a folded cloth soaked in a lavender compress and placed it gently across Ava's brow. The child's breathing eased almost instantly, and then Naomi began to hum. At first, it was barely more than a whisper, a melody threaded into the quiet of the room. Malik froze, the ladle slipping from his hand because he knew that tune. His late wife had sung it countless nights when Ava was small, a gospel hymn she'd learned from her own mother, altered with silly words to make the child laugh through her tears. Hearing it now was like having a door to the past cracked open. He sank into the armchair, his head in his hands, shoulders trembling with a grief he had kept locked away. Tears spilled before he could stop them. Naomi's voice wavered for half a moment when she noticed, but she kept singing until Ava drifted into sleep. Only then did she turn her gaze toward Malik. "You couldn't have known," he whispered finally, his voice raw. Naomi shook her head gently, her own eyes shining. "I didn't have to know," she said softly. "Some things just find their way back." From that night forward, they moved through life differently. Naomi still asked for his thoughts on campaigns. Malik still leaned on her when work pulled him away. Ava still looked for her at bedtime, expecting 2 stories instead of 1. Slowly, steadily, the lines between their separate lives blurred until 3 people, once strangers, had begun to weave themselves into something resembling a family. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope. Malik stared at it for a long time before daring to open it, his fingers trembling as if they already knew the weight of what was inside. When he finally unfolded the paper, his eyes darted to the first line and then froze. A full scholarship, a year-long training program in Oregon, specialized certification that could change everything for him and Ava. His chest swelled with pride, but almost immediately the pride collapsed into fear. Because opportunity often came at the cost of what you loved most. For 3 days, he carried the letter folded in his pocket. At last, he told Naomi one afternoon at the park while Ava chased bubbles across the grass. "I got the scholarship," he said, his voice tight. "It's in Oregon. A year away. I don't want you to think I'm walking away now that things feel steady." Naomi leaned back on the bench, studying him with a gaze that held no judgment. "Loving someone doesn't mean holding them back," she said softly. "It means not clipping their wings." The words pierced through him. He had braced himself for disappointment, for anger. Instead, she gave him freedom, and in that freedom, a deeper kind of love. When the day of departure came, Malik tried to stay strong for Ava. Their apartment was stripped down to essentials. Naomi arrived quietly that evening with dinner. Together, the 3 of them made a paper chain, each link marking 1 week until his return. Ava giggled as the chain grew long, but her eyes grew serious as she looped the final piece. Later, as the night grew heavy, Malik knelt to hug his daughter goodbye. Before he could speak, Ava ran into Naomi's arms, pressing her face against the woman's shoulder. "You're not going far," she whispered, her small voice trembling but certain. Daddy says hearts don't care about distance. Naomi's throat tightened as she held the child close, her eyes meeting Malik's across the room. In that gaze was everything they couldn't put into words: gratitude, longing, and a promise not bound by time or space. A year later, Boston's air felt different to Malik. He stepped through the staff entrance of the hospital, his new ID badge clipped to a freshly pressed white coat. Malik Johnson, certified medical technician. The words looked almost unreal, like a promise finally kept. An envelope arrived on his desk that same morning, its script elegant and familiar. An invitation, product launch celebration, Caldwell Organics, her first spoon, rooftop garden, 3 p.m. The rooftop was strung with lights, the late afternoon sun washing the rows of chairs in gold. Tables overflowed with samples in pastel-colored boxes. On each box was a subtle silhouette of a woman holding a child close, a spoon in her other hand. Malik's throat tightened as he read the tagline beneath: "For the women who stayed hungry to feed hope." At the podium, Naomi stood tall, her voice carrying with the clarity of someone who had built empires. She talked of nourishment, dignity, and second chances. And then, in the middle of the crowd, her eyes found him. For a moment, the world shrank until it was just the two of them. When the speech ended, Naomi moved through the crowd with quiet purpose. She stopped only when she stood close enough that the space between them carried its own gravity. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said softly. "I wasn't sure you'd still want me here," Malik replied. "Impossible," she whispered, and with that, she reached into her pocket. She didn't kneel, didn't make a spectacle. She simply opened a small velvet box, revealing a plain band with a single unassuming stone. "I don't want to save you," she said, her voice low but firm. "I just want to stay. If you'll let me." Malik's breath caught. He looked at the ring, then at her face, so open, so unguarded, and simply nodded. Yes. That evening, they returned to the restaurant where everything had begun. The same polished wood, the same candlelight, but the table by the window was no longer lonely. Malik sat beside Naomi, their hands linked with ease, while Ava climbed happily into her own chair, her beaded braids bouncing as she settled in. The server who had once delivered pasta to a man with downcast eyes now smiled knowingly as he set menus before them. Naomi leaned close, her voice warm. "Order whatever you want tonight. We eat for the man who once waited and the little girl who believed in him." Ava giggled, pulling a folded paper from her backpack. She spread it across the table proudly, a drawing of 3 brown-skinned stick figures at a dinner table under a roof with a yellow door. "This is us," she said. "Daddy, Mommy Naomi, and me." Malik's eyes shimmered as he looked from the drawing to the 2 faces before him. A year ago he had walked into this restaurant with nothing but $50 and fragile hope. Now he sat at the same table with everything he had ever needed: love, family, and a future that no longer felt out of reach. Candlelight flickered. Laughter rose from nearby tables. And for the first time in years, Malik allowed himself to believe without reservation. Not a rescue, not a fairy tale, just a quiet miracle. 3 chairs at one table, and the beginning of a life they would build together.